So I wanted to start out, and I wanted you to tell me a little bit about, because I've never asked you this, why you decided to do ROTC.
Well, at Gettysburg it was compulsory for the first 2 years, freshman year and sophomore year. And then you had to decide whether you wanted to go forward in your junior and senior year. And when you did that, you committed to going into the service when you graduated and being commissioned a second lieutenant when you graduated. And in 1965, when I had to decide on that, I thought that I would be drafted anyway, together with the rest of my generation. And I decided it was better to go in as an officer, meaning a lieutenant, than it was to go in as an enlisted man. Better to go into an officer as an officer because you had choices and you know, quite frankly, a little bit more power to determine what kind of positions and jobs you were going to have, as opposed to as enlisted men, where you're just going to be told where you're going to go. And I thought the whole generation, our whole generation, was going to go to Vietnam. So I decided to sign up for ROTC, and that's why. You know, in 1965, we committed to Vietnam in a way that we hadn't before. The Marines landed in March of 1965, and the escalation of the war went up dramatically. And it became clear to me as we went through 65 and 66 that this war was a mistake. By the time I graduated, I was totally against the war. I thought it was a huge mistake. But nevertheless, I was commissioned, you know, in June of '67, and on the day I graduated, I got my orders for Vietnam. So I was commissioned as second lieutenant. Despite the fact that I was against the war, I was going to serve.
What was it like being in college and knowing that that was what you were going to do after?
When you're 19, 20, and 21, you don't have the same sort of concerns and fears that you have when you're older, and you basically did not have the fear of going over here. Even though, you know, years later I look back and 10% of the people that went over, 10% of the Americans that went over became casualties. But I didn't know that at the time. The administration at that time, the Kennedys and then later the Johnson administration, bought into this whole idea of a domino effect, that if Vietnam went communist, then all of Southeast Asia had the possibility of going communist. It was a very difficult time, and the war wasn't very clear why we were fighting it. And as it ground on, and it went on for 10 years, you know, the American people, particularly the young people, became more unified that this war was a mistake. And it ultimately, after the Tet Offensive in '67, January 31st, 1967, changed public opinion, and the war turned on that. And then it became a question about how quickly we could get out. The same airport that we came into yesterday, Tan Son Nhut Airport.
Yeah.
And I flew Pan Am, and I went into a bus, and together with loads of other guys was transported to something called the 90th Replacement Battalion, which was in Long Binh, about 30 miles from here. And I waited for my orders, and I got called, and I was called down to interview with a colonel who said, well, we have two positions for you. You can choose either one of these. And he said, one is we have a need for a searchlight platoon leader, and the other one is as a forward observer in artillery. I wasn't trained in either one of those. All I knew about searchlight activities was as soon as you turned on the light at night, everybody knew where you were. What I knew about forward observers, and one of the reasons the colonel was offering me that position, was that the life expectancy of a lieutenant who was a forward observer was about 2 weeks. There was obviously a need. And so I said to the colonel, listen, I said, I just got out of college here and I was in supply school. I said, I think I'm the wrong guy. Okay, all right. But you go back to the 90th Replacement Battalion and we'll think about something else for you. And I go back to the fact that had I been enlisted, he would have said, that's an order, you know, and you wouldn't have had. But because you were an officer, you had a certain amount of
clout.
Well, you had a certain amount of clout, even though you were 21 years old. But, so I went back to the 90th Replacement Battalion, I waited another few days, and then I was called down, and I said, we have a need for a supply officer or a compound coordinator, they were calling it, for the headquarters of 2nd Field Force in Vietnam. And the Army had rented a street in Bien Hoa called Cong Ly Street. And they needed a compound coordinator there who would provide security, water supply, electricity, and make sure that housing was available for the officers and so forth. But it was a temporary assignment because we were moving the whole headquarters out to Long Binh. So I stayed there about a month, and then I went to the new headquarters. And we were in a friendly area, or what we thought was a friendly area. Later on we found out that the VC were everywhere, Viet Cong were everywhere, all around Bien Hoa. So I had not signed on to be an infantry officer, I'd signed on to be a supply officer, which was fine. And everything was fine until the Tet Offensive. And that changed everything for everyone. And we may have won, technically, the Tet Offensive by killing 17 Vietnamese for every one American soldier that was killed. But we lost in the sense that the American people realized that why should we continue to put more troops in there and have them come back in body bags? I mean, it was a tragedy. It really was. But I think the morale in country changed too, as people realized, you know, soldiers realized that, my God, this, what, you know, why are we fighting this war? What is it all about? And, you know, I'm losing a buddy here or a buddy there. Is it worth it? And that continued from 68 through 75, and it just got worse and worse and worse, I think. I mean, we ultimately lost 57,000 young people, my generation, you know, and then 300,000 that were casualties, one way or another. And, you know, post-traumatic stress wasn't something that we had a name for back then, but there were so many people that had it, you know, so many people. And I mean, when I came back, I roomed with my good friend. I would wake up in the middle of the night and he'd come into my bedroom. I'd be down on the floor, hugging the bedpost, sweating and everything, you know. So I was haunted by, you know, by stuff that I had seen over here. And when we were shelled during Tet, you know, it had an impact on me, as I'm sure it had an impact on so many other people. And we didn't have a word for it, but they do now. Most people don't know what it's like to be shelled and to think you're going to die, you know, or being attacked. It's a very traumatizing experience.
Does it remind you of when you were here, or does it look completely different?
You know, no, I mean, it's changed dramatically. I mean, there were no skyscrapers back then. There was there are no tall buildings, and I look out here and I just see dozens and dozens of buildings and new buildings going up. And I mean, this was a country that was turned upside down by the war. And, it was, in many ways, a lot of people living in poverty, and changed dramatically. And then when we came back in '81, it was the same sort of thing. I mean, so I look at it now with the economy booming and people, wanting to get ahead and starting businesses, and I think it's a very exciting time. It was a lot of responsibility, which is what you get in the Army when you're an officer and you're young. And I was the youngest lieutenant at that time in Vietnam. So I was I was a kid, probably a whole lot more responsibility than you would get until you're in your 40s or maybe even 50s. I learned a lot about managing people, a lot about how to get things done. So I grew a lot.